Alright folks, it's time for the final episode of my Destiny 2 subclass tier list video series. We've already gone through 8 of the 9 light subclass branches in the game, so if you've missed any of the previous videos you can check them out with the link in the top right now. This series has been incredibly fun to make, and I plan on doing something similar for the stasis subclasses that were added in the Beyond Light expansion. So if you've been enjoying this series, stay tuned for more. Also, if you're a Patreon subscriber, keep your eyes out for this weekend because there is a bonus video coming about this series. With all of that in mind, for the season finale, we're going to add the Hunter's Arcstrider to the list. Let's get started. If you've been watching from the start, then you already know that each subclass has a set of universal mechanics. For the Arcstrider, you have 2 class abilities, Gambler's Dodge and Marksman's Dodge, 3 jumps, High Jump, Strafe Jump, and Triple Jump, and 3 grenades, the Skip Grenade, the Arc Bolt Grenade, and the Flux Grenade. With those universal mechanics in mind, we're going to start things off with the middle branch of the Arcstrider, the Way of the Current. Its melee ability is Tempest Strike. After sliding, hit your melee button to unleash an arc wave that damages enemies in its path. Ebb and Flow is a passive. Hitting a target with an arc ability electrifies them. Meleeing electrified enemies disorients them and grants grenade, melee, and dodge cooldown reduction. Also, arc ability kills reduce the cooldown of your arc abilities. This effect isn't listed in the description, but it is there. Lightning Weave is another passive that causes melee hits to greatly increase your reload speed, and finally Whirlwind Guard is a passive for your super. While your super is active, hold down the block button to deflect incoming projectiles, and deflecting projectiles triples the damage of your arc staff for a short time. The Way of the Current was one of the 9 subclass branches that were added in the Forsaken expansion, so it won't come as much of a surprise that it's high on the list, but the question is, how high can it go? We'll start off with the melee Tempest Strike. It has range, so that means it's got a leg up over other melee abilities that require an actual punch, but its damage isn't the greatest. If you find yourself below the required level for content, Tempest Strike won't score you many kills even against red bars, but it will weaken big groups of enemies if you can line them up correctly. Tempest Strike also doesn't have a very thick radius, so it can be difficult to hit targets with it. With that in mind, not getting kills with the Way of the Current's abilities isn't the worst thing ever. Ebb and Flow is a very well designed passive ability because it has multiple ways to interact with it. Whenever an enemy survives your attacks, you have to judge whether or not it's safe to run in and punch them in the nose for crowd control and cooldown reduction. I like risk-reward mechanics, but in Destiny 2's sandbox, crowd controlling a single target isn't rewarding enough for the risk involved in running out of cover to punch something in the face. Ebb and Flow would be a lot better if the disorient effect could hit more than the target that you punch. Also, Beyond Light brought down the value of a lot of the crowd control effects in the game. The Hunter's Smoke Bomb and the Disorient from Ebb and Flow are nothing compared to a single stasis grenade. The only saving grace for the traditional crowd control that existed before Beyond Light and Stasis is that its effect will persist even while damaging the target. If you damage a target that's frozen with Stasis, they'll break out of it. So, Ebb and Flow is good but not so great. Lightning Weave is another good ability, but it's also not so great. It's plagued with all of the same problems that the CQC-focused Titan branches had. The increase in reload speed gained from Lightning Weave is so high that it feels good to trigger, but like always, Destiny 2's lack of defensive options make it unwise to run into melee range once you crank the difficulty up. Lastly, Whirlwind Guard adds a layer of fun and skill to the Arc Staff that, if capitalized on, can help you squeeze a lot of extra damage out of your super. Raising your guard for just long enough to trigger the damage buff will let you burst down mini-bosses and champions, and the activation of Arc Staff has a Whirlwind Guard, so if you time it right, you can start your super with triple damage, which is awesome. I like Whirlwind Guard a lot, and I like Arc Staff a lot too, but Arc Staff is also not strong enough to escape the criticism that I've had about roaming supers since the beginning of this series. They don't do enough damage. Arc Staff's damage and duration skyrockets when you equip the Raiden Flux exotic chest piece, but exotics shouldn't be required to make a super feel valuable. An exotic can push a super over the edge into god tier territory like the Orpheus rig does for the Night Stalker's tether, but the tether is still great without it. It's a damage debuff for your entire team and massive AoE crowd control for a long duration. The Orpheus rigs increases the frequency of use, but doesn't increase the power of each individual tether. Meanwhile, the Raiden Flux makes the Arc Staff feel the way it always should, and that's not great. So, where does the Way of the Current go on the list? It's not S tier as much as I would like it to be. The neutral game is fun, but the damage is relatively low, and some of its mechanics are unsafe with no way to make them safer. Arcstaff is a fine super, but it's not strong enough. The Way of the Current is definitely not F tier, but it's also not A tier either. For all the good things it has going for it, there are shortcomings too, so I'm gonna have to put the Way of the Current in B tier. It's a nice subclass branch, but it needs to be tuned up before it's great. Next up, we're gonna add the Arcstrider's bottom branch, the Way of the Wind. Its melee ability is Disorienting Blow. You strike an enemy with this melee ability to disorient the target and nearby enemies. Focused Breathing is a passive, Sprinting recharges your dodge ability, and your maximum sprint speed is increased. Lightning Reflexes is another passive. You're harder to kill while dodging. Finally, your last ability is another passive, Combat Meditation. While critically wounded, your melee and grenade recharges significantly faster. The Way of the Wind's abilities are designed to enhance the most basic moment-to-moment gameplay in Destiny 2 without you having to interact with the game in a different way. And it does a good job of that, but sadly it's not incredibly powerful. We talked a little bit about passive abilities before, and we're going to again because the Way of the Wind has 3 strong passive abilities, but they're overshadowed simply because they're taking up too much space. Here's the question: how much value does a passive ability provide when it's triggered? Combat Meditation speeds up your offensive ability cooldowns when critically wounded, but it doesn't speed them up enough to drastically shift the tide of battle in your favor. I think the catchphrase for the Arcstrider is, it's nice, but it's not game-changing. Combat Meditation is an example of a passive ability that should have a base level function and an additional function when a special criteria is met. In other words, cooldown reduction to your offensive abilities during combat should always be active, and that cooldown reduction should increase when you're critically wounded. Focused Breathing is fine. The increased sprint speed is something nice to have, but you won't ultimately notice it if you play the Way of the Wind a lot, which by the way you shouldn't, but you will miss it when it's gone. The cooldown reduction on your dodge, however, is something incredibly nice. However, there is a problem. The Hunter's Gambler's Dodge class ability resets your melee ability when used near enemies. So naturally, reducing the cooldown of your dodge while sprinting is a great thing, but it's only great if you have a strong melee ability, and the Way of the Wind does not. Disorienting Blow, like many other abilities in the game, is a relic from another time. Crowd controlling enemies is nice, but CC alone isn't a selling point in Destiny 2's current sandbox. For CC to be good, it's gotta be connected to something else like damage or cooldown reduction or defense. For example, the Titan gets a lot of points from me for its crowd control options. The Flashbang is a grenade with a good radius, good damage, and good duration on its blinding effect. All of that combines together to make a great tool. Disorienting Blow does what it's supposed to do. It disorients enemies in a decent radius, but its damage isn't any different from a standard melee hit, and it's only usable in melee range, and that's not good enough. The final passive ability in the Way of the Wind is... I'll say it one more time, it's nice, but it's not game-changing. The description is a little bit vague, but essentially, Lightning Reflexes is giving you damage reduction whenever you dodge. It's fine, but it doesn't synergize with the rest of your kit at all. Also, the effect is only lasting while you're actively dodging. It doesn't have a persistent effect once the dodge is over, so... it sucks. Anyway, look, this subclass branch is bad, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. It's going into F tier. It feels bad, and we're going to move on to something better. For the final subclass branch in the series, we're going to look at the Arcstrider's top branch, the Way of the Warrior. Combination Blow is your melee ability. When you kill an enemy with it, you trigger health regeneration and increase your melee damage for a long duration. Combat Flow is another passive ability. Melee kills recharge your dodge. Deadly Reach is yet another passive ability. Dodging increases your melee range. Finally, Lethal Current is a passive that affects your super. After dodging, each Arcstaff hit creates a damaging lightning aftershock. The Way of the Warrior is the most Titan-like subclass available to hunters. It does some things incredibly well, but it's sadly burdened by some of the same issues that the CQC-focused melee Titans have to grapple with. Combination Blow and Combat Flow have a very fun interaction with the Gambler's Dodge class ability, and it creates a gameplay loop that's satisfying and powerful, especially when paired with the Lair's Handshake exotic gloves. This is a little bit dense, but stick with me and it'll all make sense. The Layer's Handshake exotic perk causes using an arc melee or being hit by a melee to empower your next melee attack, which provides bonus damage and a fixed amount of healing. So, the exotic is adding an on-hit effect to your melee attacks, while Combination Blow is providing a powerful, stacking damage buff every time you kill an enemy with it. Merge the two together, and you'll be One Punch Man. This playstyle works well until the game's difficulty and damage scales up. Whether it's the Nightfall Ordeal or a legendary Lost Sector, you'll be hard-pressed to engage with the gameplay loop the Way of the Warrior is supposed to use without dying. This problem could be rectified if Destiny 2 had more defensive options for players to mod into their armor, but it doesn't. Funnily enough, the Beyond Light expansion added 2 new mods that provide damage resistance, but they also removed damage resistance mods at the same time, which means we're no better off than we were before. One step forward, one step back. With that said, the Way of the Warrior has an edge above its Arctitan counterparts. Its melee damage is significantly higher, ridiculously higher, so when you do manage to close the gap safely, it's game over for your enemies, no questions asked. Seriously, you can kill champions in 2 or 3 punches, and if you have a shotgun with the perk Trench Barrel or 1-2 Punch, nothing is going to survive your assault. You might not survive either, but at the end of the day, the bad guys are gonna die, so I guess it's a win, right? Look, I have a lot of fun whenever I play the Way of the Warrior because it's silly and impractical, and somehow it's also effective. In a lot of ways, it's like the Titan's Code of the Devastator. Its damage is undeniable, but it's not easy to capitalize on the mechanics that make its damage so high. But if you do, you win the game. My mind is telling me to put the Way of the Warrior in B tier, because the only way it can punch enemies out of existence is by punching them. But my heart is saying A tier, so that's where I'm going to put it. It's not easy to play this subclass branch, and truth be told, it feels more like a B tier subclass most of the time. But if you develop a mastery of the environments you're in, you'll learn the perfect moments to punch, and then your effectiveness will speak for itself. And there we go, the Arcstrider has officially been added to the tier list, but also this is the end of the Destiny 2 subclass tier list video series. This has been a 9-week-long journey, and I'm glad to be done with it, but I'm also a little bit sad because this has been an incredibly fun and gratifying process. Building out the tier list a little bit more every week, it's been really exciting for me. I've played subclasses in Destiny that I don't normally play, and it's been fun to explore them, to see their strengths, their weaknesses, and ultimately this has made me a better player, and it's made me appreciate the really great things that exist in the game, but it's also shined a light on the really bad things that exist as well. The Attunement of Flame, the Code of the Fireforged, the Way of the Outlaw, the Way of the Wraith, the Way of the Wind, the Attunement of Vision, the Attunement of Elements, the Code of the Juggernaut. Those are all subclasses that need a lot of help. Even the stuff in B tier could use a bump so that it feels a bit better to play in all sides of the game. With that said, there is a great selection of stuff to choose from in A tier and S tier, so if you are looking to engage with the game at a higher level, you do have options. But unfortunately, not everything is going to be a good choice when you start to crank up that difficulty. With all of that said, there is still plenty more Destiny 2 content coming in the future. The Beyond Light expansion is teeming with stuff to do and stuff to talk about, so definitely stay tuned for that. If you've been enjoying this series, you're definitely going to enjoy what's coming in the future. As always, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Destiny 2, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.